We're entering into the roaring 20s now as we're getting closer to things we recognize. Roaring 20s, one of my favorite times. 1920s in America is pretty amazing because there's so many different things that are going on. It's not just something really big, say, um, the economic boom that does happen. There's not just the um, the fashion, which changes so much for women in particular, but also men. It's not just the prevalence of movies and cars and the beginning of radio and the Harlem Renaissance and the leading up to the Great Depression. It's not just that. There's so much going on at this time. So when we talk about the Roaring Twenties, just keep in mind this is absolutely one of my favorite eras, and I hope you enjoy it too. So anyway, after the Great War, we're going to have a recession that comes about 1921 to 22 in the United States. But then after that recedes, what we've drawn the economic cycle on the board when we were still doing classes in person, because after you have a recession, you're either going to get deeper and go into a depression, or you're going to start to recover, right? So the United States is going to recover, and we are going to have a wild, like incredibly powerful economy, prosperity, and economic expansion. But you've got to learn from the past, and you got to see what was also going on there. There was a growth in inequality and an imbalance in wealth and poverty. Sometimes today we talk about, or we hear people talk about the wage gap, the wealth gap, the gap of whatever. But usually it's got to do with the rich and the poor. Okay, as the rich get richer, the poor get poorer. That's been a common saying for a long time. So the 1920s are going to see an incredible time of manufacturing. This is when the United States has is still really going through its second wave of the Industrial Revolution. So manufacturing, that's what we did back then. We were a manufacturing country. Remember, we overtook Great Britain as the workshop of the world. So manufacturing rises by more than 60%. So we call it the Roaring Twenties for a whole bunch of things. And I mentioned a whole bunch of stuff a few minutes ago there when I was recording that first slide for the beginning. But it's usually because of the three main reasons. Okay, the boom in the economy. Okay, number two, the rapid changes we're going to see in morals and cultural environment and societal norms and all. That's where most of the stuff I was talking about falls under. And then the time where we're coming back emotionally and every other way, really, from the Great War. So let's talk about the new economy first. And excuse me, um, why did we have this great boom in industry? Well, it's kind of obvious if we think back and we look at it. And these are going to be some of the same things that are going to actually play a role in causing the Great Depression. Okay. So the European industry had just been destroyed in World War One. It was so incredibly harmful to the economies of all the European countries who were involved and even the ones who weren't. Okay, so what we have left then is the United States, where we did not have war on our continent. We sent our men over there, and remember, we sent them toward the end, sort of in large numbers, but we didn't have boots on the ground here in the United States. So we had remained a healthy industrial power And we're gonna really continue to grow in the 1920s all the way up until, well, until we don't anymore, which is where the Great Depression is going to begin eventually. So the technology. So technology, remember, is what you're using to create products. You know, manufacturing, you're taking technology and you're using it to make goods and so on. So what we have here is the assembly line had become fairly new at that point. It had been, coming about for a while. And remember, Henry Ford did not invent the assembly line. He actually automated the assembly line. But there's going to be some changes in the 1920s that make it even a little bit more, it made it a little faster, a little bit more efficient, that type of thing. The manufacturers with automobiles are going to do just like the railroad, of course. And we talked about this in person when we mentioned automobiles before. But you're going to see the manufacturers in that industry, they're going to buy steel and rubber and glass, which means all those industries are growing, which means people who are invested in or somehow have a financial tie to the automobile industry or to any of those peripheral industries, they're going to start making some pretty good money. Now, you're going to start to see gasoline being bought from the oil corporations in larger amounts for cars. See, again, it's not like it is today where you drive around and there's a gas station, or, well, we don't really call them gas stations really anymore, I don't think. Maybe you do. I haven't heard anybody say that for a while. But really, you have like the little Minute Marts and the 7-Elevens and the Circle Ks and the Speedways and stuff where there's gas. There just happens to be gas there. Well, think about a world where you have cars, but you don't have a place to stop and refill. Okay, we talked about that briefly again, like when we were mentioning automobiles before and earlier when we were still in the classroom. But think about that and think of how it's come to the point where today there's so many cars that you have these stations where you can purchase the gasoline on practically every corner. And I know every now and then, if I'm running low on gas, like coming from the college, there's a dry spot there. There's a place where you don't really have a gas station for a little ways. There used to be one out there on what's the name of that road? Westport Road, a long time ago. It's been gone forever. But sometimes if I'm driving just almost on empty, which I've been known to do occasionally, I'm like, oh no, oh no, oh no. I'm in that weird place, and if I hit a couple of stoplights, there's not a gas station, I'm going to run out of gas. But, typically in a decent sized little town like Elizabethtown, there's going to be gas stations very conveniently located almost everywhere. And that's really going to take off in the 1920s. And again, in the 50s. Now, the 20s and the 50s, 1920s, 1950s, are so similar in so many ways. And I can't swear how far we're going to get in this class because of all the, you know, stuff going on in the world and the pandemic and all of this. I'm going to do the best I can. But if we make it to the 50s, you'll see that the 20s and the 50s are so much alike. And one of those ways is there's kind of a rise in automobile ownership in the middle class in the 1950s, buying new cars and so on. And then road construction in the 1920s, road construction, because there's so many cars, they're going to have to start building roads that will take you from point A to point B in some kind of a logical form, just like we talked about with the railroad. They're going to have to start laying tracks in a way that makes sense for you to be able to go from New York to Promontory Point, Utah, if you want to, or whatever. 1950s, we're going to see in, oh gosh, when was it? 1953, I want to say, that President Dwight Eisenhower signed the Interstate Act, where we have the, the creation of the interstates. And I think, yeah, for a while they were called superhighways, and there's all sorts of names. But the fact that we have things like Interstate 65, the odd numbers going north to south or south to north, depending on the direction you're going, and the even numbers like Interstate 40 going east to west, west to east. So the 20s and the 50s, they are going to have quite a few similarities. Now, other new industries that had come about because of the technology, radio, I mentioned earlier, movies. Now, movies are not brand new. They are absolutely not brand new. You saw movies at the end of the 1800s, remember. You had Edison and the motion picture projector and camera and all that stuff. But you are going to see something new in the 1920s. In 1927, you're going to see the very first talkie. Okay, instead of a movie where things are just moving, the silent movies, right? You're going to see a talkie where things are talking. The the movies are going to have sound, and it's going to be amazing. It's going to cause this incredible revitalization of the motion picture industry, and that's going to happen in 1927. Now you also have aviation growing. Of course, you have new home appliances like refrigerators, and electric power has come down to a lot of people, not just the businesses and the very wealthy. It's going to come down to a lot more middle class people. All of this is pushing the United States economy forward with full force. So, like you can say about the Gilded Age, the period where we talked about the corruption and everything in government. But like you can say about the Gilded Age, I mean, in the 1920s, parts of our country, you're going to see looking pretty on the outside, but if you dig inside of it, you'll see that things were just not okay. They were kind of broken on the inside. Now, part of that is going to be found in the fact that half of American people lived in the 1920s below the poverty level. Okay? More than two-thirds of the people in 1929 lived at no better than minimum comfort level. Do you know what that is? Minimum comfort level, food and water, shelter and clothing. We're not talking good clothing, fancy clothing, good food, fancy food. We're talking minimum comfort level. Again, two-thirds, and then half below poverty level. Now, the thing is, and if I were in the classroom, I would draw a line on the board, and I would say, okay, here is the standard of living for your American worker. And then here is the poverty level. Okay, so half of Americans are below that poverty level, but a lot of them actually, their standard of living improves. So does that mean that they rise above poverty? No. You can have a better standard of living. You can make a little more money. But that doesn't mean that's going to automatically take you out of poverty. Okay? And also another big improvement in the 1920s, partially on the heels of something called the Triangle Factory Fire in New York City that killed over 100 mostly young immigrant women who were working in a factory that was in a terrible state of repair in 1911. You're going to see better working conditions, okay? In the Triangle Factory Fire, those women were locked in, usually just to make sure they didn't sneak out and go try to take a break or something like that. And then when the fire happened, it was awful. There were women jumping out of the buildings and all sorts of things. You read a little bit about it. If you did the readings for that one quiz, you've already read a little bit about it. We don't really talk about it in this class except a little, like I'm doing right now. But that was at the time the worst industrial, how does that go, like the worst industrial um, tragedy, I guess, in American history up to that point. So anyway, it was a big change. So anyway, better working conditions at least came out of that, as well as more inspections, as well as more laws to start protecting the workers a little bit. Now, to discourage strikes, though, we're going to start to see something really weird. It's called welfare capitalism. Okay, now what they're doing is the owners, like Henry Ford, he's going to act as a father. Remember, paternal, pater is Latin for father. Okay, and anything that starts with pa, most everything that starts with pa, in these kind of contexts is going to have to do with a fatherly type thing. Paternalistic means fatherly, right? So a lot of the owners, They act like fathers to their workers. In other words, instead of asking the workers what they needed, they decided, well, let's do some things that will placate the workers, that will make them not complain and not want to go on strike. Henry Ford's going to shorten the work week. He's going to raise the wages. He's going to give paid vacations. Now, Henry Ford, personally, he's got a lot of negative, well, there's a lot of negative things about Henry Ford. He's very much a racist, for one thing. Look him up and check that out. But Henry Ford does help the workers in that sense, by raising wages and so on. Someone asked him one time, why? Why did you do that? What's your purpose for having done these things? And he's like, well, I don't know if he said a man or someone. I'm just going to say it sounds more like Henry Ford. A man that worked at Ford should be able to afford a Ford car. Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Makes absolute sense, doesn't it? So, U.S. Steel is going to make some efforts to try to improve sanitation in their factories. So, we're calling this welfare capitalism. And the big problem with welfare capitalism was it was sort of an illusion for the workers, where they felt as if they did have a little bit more control or they had a better lifestyle, much more than they really did. Okay, so you're going to see that as a big thing that came out of the 1920s. In the new era, we've got labor disputes threatening sometimes. Now remember that welfare capitalism is going to try to prevent most of these labor unions from rising up and trying to ask for more money or whatever conditions. But you're going to see something that comes about here as a means to control the workers, and again, giving them an illusion that they have some kind of power. These are called company unions. Now think about this. The union, remember Eugene Debs way back in the Pullman strike? He was on the side of the workers, of course. He was in oh, what was the name of that? He was the head of that union. And then on the other side, of course, was the General Managers Association. And the workers are going to be negotiating with the bosses, the owners, the executives. So when the workers are given the choice of having a company union, which is organized by the corporation itself, what good does that do? Nothing, right? It's basically a way for them to keep an eye on what the workers are talking about and what the workers may have in mind. It doesn't help the workers. So unskilled workers are going to see a, a wage increase. Now look at this. This is a period of 1920 to 1926, and only a 2% increase. The average income of the average American was $1,500 a year. Poverty level was 1,800. Okay, so again, that if you took that out and you did an inflation calculator, I'm not sure exactly what it would be right now, but you know what? I'm going to stop and I'm going to do an inflation counter. So I actually did go to the inflation calculator, and it tells me that $1,800 in 1926 would be worth $26,306.24 today. Okay, so that's the poverty level, 1,800. So that would be 26,000 today. I think the poverty level's probably fairly close to that today. Now, the cumulative rate of inflation, I think, is really interesting. It's 1,361.5%. So there you go. I love the inflation calculator. Anyway, so what happens? Sorry, it's allergies. But what happens is everybody has to work, and workers start to organize among themselves in spite of the company, whatever they might want to call them, the company unions or the company, organizations. Now, big changes happen for women in the new era. This is slide 6. Starting right here, the professional women are no longer something that's just totally new. You've seen a couple of generations of women who've been educated at places like, all women's schools or co-ed, which is men and women together in college. And they're starting to get into things like law and medicine. It takes a little bit longer for women to get into law than it does medicine because, I mean, if you think about it, it makes sense in terms of the times. But the whole idea that women should be nurturing and caring and all that, that goes along more with medicine. Okay, nurses, right? But then it kind of spills over into doctors. And the idea that men should be the ones out there fighting in the business world, you had the idea that lingered for a very long time that women should not enter into professions like law because that is too harsh for women. So it's not until 1950 something that Harvard Law School actually allows a woman into their school as a student. Still looking at women in the new era of the 20s, we've got a pretty good sized group of women that are going to be married and still work. So that's not going to be the upper class, the women who are part of very wealthy families, of course. Eleanor Roosevelt, for example, is not going to go out and get a job. But I mean, you're going to see 25% of working women were married. Now, a lot of these are going to be working class women, as in working in factories and those type of jobs, unskilled labor. But there's a lot of other unskilled labor out there, and they're emerging at this time, even though society still got women in this sort of pigeonhole that I just mentioned about nurturing and caring and that type of thing. We're going to see that the opportunities do broaden a little bit here in the 20s. Now, these jobs are going to be low paying service jobs. And unfortunately, the United States has become more of a service based economy in some ways instead of industrial, which, that's a whole other conversation. But a lot of times service jobs pay lower wages. And so these female occupations that were acceptable to society because women were either helping others in some way or they were doing something that had to do with some feminine role, these jobs became known as pink collar jobs. Now, remember, you've got the white collar, that's the professional jobs, the doctors and professors and lawyers and, professional jobs, bankers. You've got the working class, the blue collar jobs, factories and so on, mechanics and all that. And then you've got these pink collar jobs, specifically pink used to be a color that was generally it was generally identified with women, right? And girls. Now, fashion is one of those jobs that's actually low paying service occupation. It's not going to be like a big designer in Paris or something. This is going to be working in the industry, doing other things that were much less glamorous. Education, for a very long time, remember, men had taught the children, especially they said they needed to teach the children, especially at the age of about, maybe starting about 12. The boys were getting bigger, sometimes bigger than the female teachers, if there was a female teacher. So you start to see education be more acceptable for women to get into. Back in the 1800s, we start to see that really. But in the 20s, we're going to see that and this has not really changed really since the late 1800s, early 1900s, not really, that women are going to be a lot more accepted when teaching the younger kids than men, because there are sometimes men want to teach younger kids. My son did not have a male teacher in elementary school until he was in third or fourth, and I want to say fourth grade. So, that became a thing though. You're nurturing the young children. Social work, Jane Addams and Hull House and all that. University of Chicago, nursing for obvious reasons. Secretarial, that means you're working for someone else, usually a man, who's giving you tasks to do, including typing and that type of thing. Now, telephone operators, that's something that you guys do not remember. I barely remember it. I don't even know when it went away, but I don't have a ton of memories of telephone operators, but I do know there was a time when you would pick up a phone, the ones that were on your wall that AT&T literally installed for you, or maybe one that, if a little bit later, maybe one that you could carry around a little bit with a long cord in your house. But either way, I remember you would pick up the phone and you would hear a dial tone, and you could hit 0, right? You could hit that and you get the operator. Oh, or O for operator. Is it 0 or is it O? I don't know. But you would hit O for operator. And at some point in my life, though, I remember you would pick up the phone, and if you didn't say anything, someone would come on and ask if they could help you. Depends on probably where and whatever. I feel like that may have happened at my dad's school. He was a middle school principal, so I don't know. But anyway, telephone operators kind of got taken away by new technologies. Another thing that's changing for women in the 1920s, and well, the early 1900s in general, is the idea of motherhood. We have, up until around the turn of that century, you didn't really recognize, and by that I mean it wasn't something you talked about. The psychologists and I guess the doctors and whatever really didn't talk about this period called adolescence, where you're not really a kid, but you're not really a grown up, where you're right in between. And that's a distinctive stage of development. We know that now. There's certain things that happen during that time that are very important developmentally. Well, that was coming about right then in this period, the early 1900s. And you have people like John Watson, a behavioral psychologist, saying that, we've always thought that all women are just naturally going to be inclined to have children. Of course, all women want children. Well, they start to say, no, that's not true. They find that's not true. Everybody doesn't want children. And so they also find that mothers sometimes might be able to use some advice from experts. Um, I know when we adopted Zach, we got him when he was 5 hours old. But before that, for it was almost exactly a year from the time we went to apply to the time where we actually were able to adopt him, or to get him. But we had to take a ton of classes. And I have several nieces and nephews, and I'd taken care of most of them way many, 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 many times. And I knew already quite a bit about how to take care of children. But I learned some things in those classes. Now, some things I was like, oh, come on. They were teaching you how to put a diaper on a doll. Okay, great. I know how to put a diaper on a baby. There were other requirements. There was so much reading that you had to do. There were classes you had to attend. We had to go to another town to go attend classes with I guess it was a social worker. So there was a lot of stuff that we went through that was meant to teach us how to be good parents. I think everybody should have to go through that, whether they're adopting or whether they're just going to have a child, because like I said, I knew a lot about kids and I looked after a lot of kids. Oh gosh, I almost forgot. I think I blacked it out on purpose. I had worked in a lot of daycares also when I was in college. So I'd seen a lot, but I learned quite a bit, especially from some of the classes that we took where it was like lecture type classes, sit down, ask questions. And also we had first aid and just all sorts of things. So mothers do sometimes need advice, because I know when that little 5 pound boy was handed to me, I just looked and I was like, oh Lord, I don't know what to do. Oh, it all just went out the window, right? So in the 1950s, you're also going to hear this. You're going to have a guy named Dr. Benjamin Spock who's going to write this very well known guide to raising children. And everyone talked about in the 1950s. Remember, I said the 1920s, where we are at the moment, and the 1950s are very similar. So you're going to start to hear that same cry again, that sometimes it's okay to look to the experts for how to teach, or for, I'm sorry, for how to raise your child, because everyone is not naturally a mother and pick up the baby and we just know what to do with them. Totally not true. Now, middle class women, though, because of all this, they start to see their roles are changing. There's not as much emphasis on this instinctual bond between the mom and the baby. And so, as a result of that, a lot of women felt less connected to their children. We are going to see the birth rate go down, and periodically this happens. In the 1920s, one of the famous people that comes up in my women's history class is Margaret Sanger, and she was the one who founded Planned Parenthood and was a pioneer for birth control. And there's some dark stuff about Margaret Sanger. If you go and you look her up, there's some really dark stuff about the foundings of that organization and so on. But that was something that was becoming important at that time, was the ability to decide how many children you wanted to have. I love the flappers. The flappers are fun. Flappers are a distinctive group of young women in the 1920s. And this is going to be a time where you're going to have, like I mentioned earlier, jazz. You're going to have a lot of different clubs that are going to open up. And the women are going to react to some of these things, and some of those things I just mentioned are going to react to the new women. Now, flappers, there's a lot of different explanations for why they became known as flappers. The name is going to stick with the girls that were born, early 1900s and into the 1910s, but nobody can really hammer down exactly what caused them to have that nickname. Well, one of them, I just picked one. I'm like, okay, this sounds like a good one. There's absolutely no way we're ever going to solve that argument, probably. But some of the kids, the little girls wore big bows on their hair and they flapped over onto their head, so they became known as flappers. Okay, that's one. There's a whole bunch of different explanations, but again, we're not going to have a certainty as to how that nickname came for that generation, or for that generation of women. This is a more secular view of women, so it's less oriented toward religion. It's more oriented toward worldly things, like the clubs, like the music, and that type of thing. And it's going to start with the lower classes, okay? It's going to have an effect on women beyond the middle class. It actually starts with the lower, with the working class girls, or the working class women. So you have some women who are going to say, hey, you know what? My mom, my grandma, they had to be respectable and have a good reputation before any boy would ever want to date them, before any boy would ever want to marry them. They had to be respectable. And they say, you know what? I don't want to do that anymore. So, and this didn't just happen overnight. This was a thing that had been coming for a while. But they started to smoke and drink and dance and wear seductive clothing, and you'll be allowed to judge by the pictures I'm going to show you in a minute how seductive the clothing is. But well, in women's history we talk more about this, but in the early 1900s, in the late 1800s, if you go back in the Victorian age and you look up until the late the 1890s, really, the women are pretty much going to wear skirts that go all the way down to their ankles. You're really not going to see any skin, okay? And that includes your ankles. So this is a big change. So the clothing that they wear is going to change where they do show their legs. And boy, in the pictures, again, I don't know if you would necessarily call it seductive, but they are definitely trying to show you that they do have legs and they're allowed to show them. You're also going to see makeup, makeup's going to be a thing. The hair, their hair is going to be cut. Now, people like my grandmother who was born the one who was born in 1903, who was quite aged when I was born, really, but she was born 1903, and when she would watch TV and she would see women on TV, a movie or anything with shorts on, she would go into some sort of tirade about how terrible it was, or whatever. I don't even know what she would say, but she just thought it was terrible because back in her day, she said women didn't show their bodies like that. They didn't wear shorts, they didn't wear this and that and the other. Well, if my grandma was born in 1903, then she was around and a grown up during the 1920s. Now, I know the reason why she didn't think that women in her day did this stuff, like show the skin or wear makeup. Well, because I didn't grow up all my life. I didn't grow up in Kentucky, but my grandma did. She was from down south of here, and she got married when she was, I think it was 17, I think. But she was in the 1920s having children. Okay, she had my mom, and then she had my aunt, and she had another baby girl who actually died of diphtheria when she was 2 years old. So my grandma didn't know about this stuff because she was living in a very, very small town in Kentucky named Columbia. And she also was married and having children. So all of that probably actually did pass her by. Now, the speech, they're going to have very distinctive speech and slang. And then the behaviors where they're going to go out with men unchaperoned. These women, again, all of this together make them flappers. So, anyway, this kind of lifestyle is going to be, as I said, starting in the working class for the most part, and lower middle class, right? And basically the single working women. So what's happening here, of course, is they're getting some jobs in factories and some service jobs, and getting a little money on their own. And the idea had always been live at home with your parents until you get married. Some of them want independence, and so they're going to go out. And they may have a roommate, they may have a couple of roommates, but they're making their own money. And at night, they're going to go to those clubs I mentioned. They're going to go dance. Maybe they even go alone. Okay, that was nothing that you would have done before. And unchaperoned, like I said, and even riding in cars with boys. I just said that, wasn't that a movie, Riding in Cars with Boys? I think Drew Barrymore and Whoopi Goldberg and somebody else, I think, were in that. But anyway, um, you've got these women looking as if they are really liberated. You saw the ads in popular culture. You're going to see some when we talk about advertising of the 20s, where you've got the woman holding a big cigarette, like it's a big cigarette holder, was what it was called. And she's going to be wearing her hair this way, and she's going to have makeup on, and she just looks so happy in all the ads and movies. And in reality, though, just like in the boom times, the fact that half of the country was living under poverty level, you're going to see that most women still depended on men for their livelihood. Why? Well, in the workplace, they don't pay them very well because remember, if you pay the man, you're expecting that you're paying to take care of a family. If you pay the woman, you're just expecting as the employer that you're paying her to have extra money, right, for her family or whatever. But the husband's supposed to be the one taking care of the family in those days. That was the idea. So you had, women making a lot less money than men did. And at home, if a husband exploits her, there's nothing she can do because you're going to have in the United States up until a certain time. I don't remember when it was. I feel like I should look this up, but I'm not sure I could get like a specific direct answer. But there were times that if you go back far enough, you're going to have the idea of femme covert, where a woman, when she gets married, her husband then becomes the owner of everything she had, all of her property, even if she inherits from her father, and even if the husband divorces her, he keeps her land. It's his. Okay. Now, those laws had changed and some of that had gone away. But I know as recently, probably as, you know what? I'm going to look that up. Give me another second. Yeah, I thought it was the 70s. I wasn't sure when. Okay, so as recently as the 70s, credit cards are a lot of times only going to come about as a result of the husband signing for it. Now, it's not until 1974 that it was called the Equal Credit Opportunity Act of 1974. Write that down. I might throw that in on a test to see if you're listening. Okay. Equal Credit Opportunity Act of 1974, that it became illegal to refuse a credit card to a woman based on her gender. So that's really interesting. I knew it was in the 70s. I was pretty sure it was in the 70s, and I just couldn't really make sure of that without looking it up. Now, I know that the first credit cards, I know that those horrible things came out in the 1950s. So for probably at least 20 years, women couldn't get a credit card if they were married without the husband signing for it. Anyway, I think that's a very interesting thing. Okay, so let's move on to the next one. Really, there's not a lot to say. I mean, it's pictures that I put on there from the 20s, and as I said, they definitely show that they've got legs. They're like, look, we've got legs. And you see the one woman sitting there. Is she sitting? Yes, she's sitting right on that guy's leg, on his lap, while he's playing a ukulele and whatever kind of thing she's got. Is that an instrument? Is that a purse? I don't know what that is. Anyway, unless that was her husband, that would have been frowned upon. And to be honest, a few years before that, it would have been frowned upon even if it was her husband. You don't do that in public. And notice also that all of them are wearing their hair very short. Now, I was also thinking about my grandma too, that she never cut her hair until I can remember it. I mean, I don't know, it was probably in the 70s when I was a little kid, but she never cut her hair. She always tied it up in some kind of contraption on top of her head. I don't know what it was called. It wasn't a bun. It was some kind of hairstyle that was specific. But my grandmother never cut her hair. So this would have been her contemporaries. These would have been the women that grew up at the same time as my dear sheltered grandma. So cutting their hair, that was one means of rebellion. More pictures of flappers. One interesting thing down at the bottom is, again, this is a party, it looks like, of mixed gender. You've got men and women in there partying together, heaven forbid. I always want to say that line from Ghostbusters. It was Ghostbusters, right? Dogs and cats living together, mass insanity. I don't know. But you've got just such to me, when I look back at this, I'm thinking how quaint it is. Well, their moms and their dads, and heaven forbid their grandparents, thought that these women were just absolutely immoral for the things they were doing. So we see women's rights activism coming up here, and women got the right to vote in 1920 with the 19th Amendment, and that was federal, of course, constitutional amendment. But women had been allowed to vote in some places in local elections, sometimes out west. But this was the first time they were going to be able to vote en masse in, for example, 1920, a presidential election. So woman suffrage was a big, big deal at this time, and the women had been working for it for so very long. Now, what happens here, though, is in 1921, the Shepard-Towner Act comes about, and it's providing some help for women. You know, prenatal child health care programs, all sorts of things that will help the women who are pregnant. Well, it becomes controversial, and there's Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood and stuff, and she says, you know, these programs, if you actually examine the mom and the baby and the child, oh man, then why are women going to want to use birth control? They'll just keep having more kids because, you know, why not? And I'm thinking, oh my goodness, do they, I mean, is having a child and raising a child really that easy that you think if the child has the the care that they need, health care, prenatal care, that you'll just keep having babies? I mean, seriously, Margaret Sanger, my goodness. But anyway, what happens here is in 1929, the act was actually terminated. And here's one reason, okay? Women were not getting together and voting as a block. We really don't see that. We don't see that today. Rarely do a majority of women come together on just about anything. And that's, I mean, that's normal. That's the way it is. Men are not a voting bloc, clearly, right? So why did we expect women to be? I don't know. But when it comes to things that specifically apply to women, it was clear that they weren't actually going to agree on these, whatever it is, these issues, right? So even something like that becomes controversial. So if you look at the very bottom, the last bullet that I have, the results, it's clear that women in electorate are not speaking loudly enough. And I should also add, as I just did, they're not speaking with one voice or even close to one voice. There are today many voting blocs in the United States that vote for certain issues and vote for a certain party for different reasons. But with women, see, we're not really going to change the electoral outcome because our vote, starting here, 1920, is generally going to be distributed about, just like the men, you know, different ideas, different thoughts, and different leanings, and different regions, and different religions, and different family, I guess, influences. There's all kinds of things. Now, I will tell you that for a while, the women, when they first started voting, for a while, quite a few women told of asking their husbands or their brothers or their fathers or some man in their life how to vote on certain things because they really didn't understand it or they didn't think they did. So a lot of times they would just go and ask their husband if they were married. So the politicians are not going to feel too much concern. So in the new culture, we're going to see a couple things going on. We're going to have people moving into the cities and being more materialistic. Now, to be fair, the late 1800s was a very materialistic time for Americans, and we have our ebbs and flows sometimes. But as the consumer-oriented culture became more and more and more prevalent, you're going to see that the big corporations, the big companies that are making certain products are going to start to kind of homogenize the way Americans look at their world. Now, homogenization, you know, anytime you see the root of that in anything like that, homogenize means to sort of make them the same, sameness, right? So let me take you back before the 20s, okay? And again, this is where the 20s and the 50s have some very strong characteristics that are similar. But we go back to the time before the 1920s, and if you live, say, in Chicago, okay, You probably don't travel a lot if you're your average person, working class person. You probably don't travel very far. And you see things in Chicago, you see the local stores, you see the mom and pops, you see certain brands that are relatively localized that maybe you can only get in the state of Illinois, maybe only certain things you can get toward the east of the United States or whatever. Okay. So what we start to see increasingly for several different regions, or well, several different reasons throughout the regions, that's a mouthful, we're going to see that people start to have similar experiences with American culture, whether they're living in the deep South or whether they're living in, I don't know, Idaho or New York City or whatever. Okay. They're going to start to have certain things that are going to be found across America. And today there's tons of examples of things like that. I mean, start with McDonald's. Everywhere you go, there's going to be a McDonald's. I mean, how many do we have in Elizabethtown? 28, 29. I always joke about that. I think there may be 6. I don't know. But there's certain things that didn't exist, and really some things didn't exist until the 50s that homogenized America even more so. All right. So in the 20s, you're going to have this culture changing. They're going to have different values, and we're going to come back to the way that culture's homogenized. Believe me, when we get to advertising, we're coming back to that. But the new set of values that's emerging here in the 1920s is going to show just how rich the rich were getting and just how fragile and yet extraordinarily complex the economy had become in America. We were nationalizing since really, I mean, we were really nationalizing, if you recall, actively nationalizing ourselves since at least well, we were trying after the Civil War, but the late 1800s. And we're going to start to see ourselves as a nation, and we're trying to think of ourselves as Americans more, more than we did maybe before. But the thing that helps more than anything is going to be this pop culture stuff, this mass culture that is more uniform. Again, it's going to be the same in some cases, no matter where you go in the United States. So people who are divided by region, again, like I said, the South or New York City, race, religion, gender, class, all of these things had shaped the way you responded when you were in your own little area, right? You're in Chicago, you only know about Chicago style pizza or something specific to Chicago. And you don't know about what's happening up there in the East Coast. You don't understand, you don't care about what's going on down in the Southwest. You're not tuned in as a culture. That is where our pop culture comes in. And all of those things that used to control the way we looked at our national cultural messages, those things like region, race, religion, gender, and class are going to become less important than they had a generation before. So keep that in mind. We'll come back to that again. A big part of the so-called new culture is consumerism. And like I said, materialism. Buying for pleasure, not because you need it. Now, does anybody really need a 70-inch television? If we were in class, someone would be like, yes. No, you don't. Okay, that's a pleasure buy. That's not a need. Remember, food, shelter, well, food, water, shelter, clothing. These are your needs, right? So buying for pleasure becomes a really big thing in the 1920s, as it had started a little bit earlier. But middle class families are going to be the big ones here because they're living above the poverty level. They're not rich, right? Middle class is not considered wealthy. Upper middle class is, making pretty good living, but middle class, not wealthy, just okay, comfortable. So they're the ones that are buying a lot of these new appliances, electric refrigerators. Wow, right? Washing machines. Wow. I can't imagine living without either one of those two. That would be really really difficult. Electric irons, I have to say, you may have noticed, I don't like to dress up even, well, no matter what, I really don't like to dress up. But ironing is not something I've done for a few years. I'd be perfectly fine without an electric iron. And vacuum cleaners, ooh, I don't have a lot of carpet in my house, but where I have it, I could not live without that. So these things absolutely changed everything for the mother. Besides the fact that her children are going to school and they're staying gone longer in the day, they're starting school earlier. The women are being told that they can feel okay about not having that instinct to be a mom. Well, okay, so what are the women thinking? What are they going to do? Well, a lot of them are just going to really turn to volunteer work and reform movements, and a lot of them are going to take a lot more time around their houses. However, all of these new things made their work so much easier. Now imagine a time before you had any of those. Imagine how difficult just getting through anything was. I mean, if you lived in the city, you were lucky because you could go to the grocery store hopefully every day. Actually, you wouldn't really have necessarily a grocery store. You would have the butcher, and you would have the what is it, the place where you buy the greens. I can't remember the green grocer type things, and it was kind of all separated out before you had what was called the supermarket. You sometimes hear people say that term, but it took a lot of time when you could not store anything in your house easily to eat. You're going to the store all the time, or to whatever stores you needed to go to. So before the electric refrigerators, you had ice boxes. There's a great old TV show. There's not that many episodes of it that were ever made, but it's become a classic, called The Honeymooners, with Jackie Gleason. And in that in that TV show, it was shot live, which is very interesting to me also, just in and of itself. But it was shot live, really basically in one room. And they had an ice box over there. Now, if you've ever heard an older person call a refrigerator an ice box, that's where that comes from. Comes from either hearing it, probably because this is a long time ago, but hearing from their parents or maybe their grandparents that what that thing was sitting there in the kitchen was an ice box. Well, they used to be really literally ice boxes where you could keep a few things in it. You could keep them cold for a little while. The electric refrigerator is going to change all that. So if you look over on the right side of the screen, or on the slide, you're going to see that General Electric is going to put out this monitor top um, refrigerator, and I want you to look at it, and it may take you a second to look at how enormous this thing is. Okay, you look at it and you're like, wow, that's kind of tiny. That's like the refrigerator in my office or my mom's office, or hey, look at that, that's tiny. But look again, okay, you see the doors. Well, the door, there's a white one, and then look behind that, that's a door that closes that refrigerator. This is a huge thing. Okay, look on the top of that little tiny thing, and you see whatever part of the motor freezing, whatever that is. The part right below that, the part where it looks like you have a little kind of a round box of some sort up there, kind of hanging on up at the top, but inside the refrigerator, that's called a freezing unit. Now, my mom used to call the freezer in a refrigerator, she used to call that the freezing unit. And as teenagers and kids are sometimes annoyed by their parents, just like my 12-year-old who's in the other room, probably annoyed at me for something. I'm just kidding. But as we sometimes, at adolescence, sometimes we get annoyed at things our parents say. We're like, oh, why do you say that? Don't say that around my friends. Oh, I really, really hated it when my mom called the freezer part of the refrigerator the quote freezing unit, end quote. I did not know until I was a grown up studying pop culture history that that actually was a thing that, I mean, she was born in 1930, so she would have grown up with freezing units. So sometimes, if if your parents say crazy things that you think are crazy, perhaps it's just something that's come down and you've had to listen to it because of, the time that's passed and they've kept it in their minds. Okay. So anyway, these things revolutionize housework. And again, I can't imagine living without those. Now, again, look at the price though. 1927, which is a big year for a lot of things, they're going to sell that for $300. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to stop and check my handy dandy inflation counter so I can tell you exactly what that thing would have cost in today's money. Holy cows, you guys, I expected this, but nah, wowza, look at this. 1927, $300 today, in our money today, would be $4,459.97. Well, okay, for what they're getting, okay. All right, love my inflation calculator. Highly recommend it. I've said this before when we were in class. Arguably, the most important thing that's come out as far as the inventions anywhere around this time and in the early part of the 20th century is going to be the car. Okay. We've already talked some of the things that were so important about the car. We talked about that in class in person. But one thing I want you to know now is just how much it changed your life if you were able to afford to get a car. Okay. It's going to expand your geographical horizons. Most people didn't travel more than 50 miles from where they were born their entire lives. Well, the car is going to start to help change that because a lot of people, even when the trains, remember we mentioned this in class, even when we had the railroads hauling tons of people and goods and whatever, people usually couldn't afford to do that. So you can escape the country if you're living out in the country, and you can go into the city if you're living in the city and go out to the country for a break. So it transforms the idea of a vacation. Only the rich people used to be able to take a vacation. Okay, well, it's not going to be that way anymore. You can get in your car and you can go wherever you can go as the roads are being made. And there's I don't know how long it takes. There's a lot of time. I was mentioning this earlier about the roads, but I don't know how long it really took for them to be meaningful. But I will tell you that the big road that was very important, well up until I want to say somewhere between the 50s and 70s. Yikes. Okay, I don't know exactly, but somewhere in there between the 50s and 70s, you're going to see the decline of what was called Route 66. Okay, if you've ever seen the movie Cars, that was a real thing that happened, except for the cars, talking and doing all that. But Route 66 would take you pretty much across the country. And Route 66 had all these great tourist traps and stops that you could make. And you could drive across the country. There's an episode of I Love Lucy where they are doing that on Route 66. I know back in the 70s when I was a little kid, we did try to take Route 66 as much as we could because parts of it were already gone, just like in the movie Cars. As the interstates come, the super highways, as they come after the 1950s, and by the 1970s they're prevalent, you're going to see that Route 66 is not as necessary for people to travel to go from, pretty much across the country. I know you can at least go from, or you could, I'm sorry, you could at least go from Chicago to California on Route 66, if I'm not mistaken. But we used to travel Route 66, the areas that were still around, quite a bit, and there were some absolute fabulous tourist traps. I know I call them tourist traps, but I say that in a kind way. I've got a little tiny mug, a little tiny mug that says Route 66 on it that I just treasure. And I tried to do that in the 90s. I tried to go um, take a trip with someone across from California back to visit some family in Kentucky and tried to find the pieces of Route 66. And even by the 90s, there were still a little, not very many, but that's going to be the first big road that's going to become iconic, right? Now, the young people are going to end up being able to form their own kind of culture with their own kind of music and slang and everything, because before the car, a lot of times, I mean, kids are going to be sitting with their parents a lot. And in middle class and upper class families, the daughters, remember, they're not allowed to date. They're gonna be courting in the parlor room or whatever, right? I mean, those are real things. Those are real things that happen. And in the lower classes, the whole concept of arranged marriages or of chaperones, that was a little bit less strict, which is one reason that the flappers were able to really take hold in the working class women. Okay, so the youth, they're going to be able to get away from the parents. I love slide 17. Slide 17 is great. It's just some ads that I found for some cars from the 1920s. And to, to me, and maybe to you, they sort of all look alike. But some of them didn't survive. Of course, the Halliday didn't survive. But the Lincoln and the Buick, to the best of my knowledge, are still around. But look over there what they're already doing on the right side. They've got some flappers there showing their legs. Okay? Women and cars in advertising. That's going to be a thing that starts very early on. Oh, this is my thing right here. Advertising. I told you I love pop culture. Love me some pop culture. And there's somewhere, I forgot where it is, that you can actually get I think a doctorate in pop culture. Oh, I would be in heaven. But anyway, when you look at advertising, you're getting a really good glimpse into how the people really lived at that time. You're getting a good glimpse into what they're wanting you to buy, okay, and what they're emphasizing. Now, does that mean that I'm saying we're getting a good glimpse into necessarily everyone's lifestyle? No, but you're getting a glimpse into what was actually out there for purchase, and you can get an idea of the variety sometimes. Okay. So advertising is not new. It is not new in the 20s. It's been around for a long time. But with all the consumerism, we're going to have more advertising. With more advertising, we're going to have more consumerism. So, wow, advertising is now coming of age. And another thing helping out advertising is national newspapers and mass circulation magazines. Okay, you're going to be able to get national newspapers. You can get several of them anywhere you live in the country. Remember, we're continuing to homogenize to make our country more similar no matter where you are. And national newspapers do that. Mass circulation magazines like the Saturday Evening Post, that started in the 20s. You could go pretty much anywhere in the country and you could subscribe to that, or you could generally buy it in many places in the country. Reader's Digest, which is still around, I will let you know, because I was somewhere a while back and I saw a Reader's Digest. I used to like to read those when I was a kid. I don't know why. But yeah, they're still around. They're still around. There's some cute cartoons, which is why I think I used to like to read them when I was a kid, and some decent stories every now and then. But it's not, it's not highbrow stuff. It's very easy to read and understand. But that came out in 1921 nationwide. Time Magazine, 1923. Time Magazine came out. And I have to honestly say, I don't know if Time Magazine still puts out a print version. I know it did up until at least, I don't know. Um, I'm going to say within the past couple of years. I'm sure it's been out since then. I know Newsweek went out of print several years ago because I believe I have the last actual print copy of Newsweek. But Time Magazine, I can't swear that it's still around. I think it is, but anyway, these all were everywhere in the United States. I mean, you could see these in many places. I mean, most places. So what you're seeing when you're looking in these magazines, these newspapers, is not just that you're sharing stories with a nationwide audience, but you're also sharing advertisements, things that people have, things that you want them to want. For example, look at the top there. You've got the flapper with her cigarettes and her long cigarette holder and her jewelry and her, look, showing her arms and her shoulders, heaven forbid. Oh my goodness. But anyway, look at that. Okay, cigarettes. None. If I were to ask you guys, and I don't know, I feel like I asked you, it was probably last semester, but I feel like I asked you guys already once, have you ever seen cigarettes advertised on television? And the answer to that is no, you have not, because they stopped advertising cigarettes on television when I was barely out of diapers. They banned cigarette ads on television. So none of us alive right now, and by that I mean your class of EC3 and me, can remember seeing cigarette ads on television. However, there's some interesting things that have to do with that, because in magazines, you're going to find that they started at some point to separate cigarettes from the chewing tobacco, the that stuff. And I think you were able to advertise on TV, I think, and I guess until the 80s, because I do remember chewing tobacco being advertised for some reason as an adult. But on TV and radio and stuff like that, you're not going to have any of that going on, particularly to audiences under 21. That's going to be a big thing. There used to be cigarette machines everywhere, which is a really weird thing, but I sort of remember when they were kind of around. But as far as placing their ads in magazines, I'm not sure, because the only thing that I remember about that was it has to do with the audiences. Like I said, under the age of 21. So you can't advertise cigarettes, say in I don't know, in a magazine that's meant for preschool children. So anyway, there's still rules and regulations, but I don't remember the last time I personally have seen an ad for cigarettes in a magazine. I don't know. So I remember Joe Camel, but he was like all over the place back in the 80s. And they finally got rid of him because he was a cartoon, little comic cartoon camel that they thought might entice kids to start smoking. Anyway, look down there in the bottom right hand corner and you see Babe Ruth, the Babe, what is he, the Yankee Clipper, right? See Babe Ruth out there, great baseball player. He is giving a celebrity endorsement. Babe Ruth says, quote, "It's the finest cola drink I ever tasted." Okay, there you go. Celebrity endorsement for Red Rock Cola, which I guess didn't last. You have Coca-Cola, though, right next door to it, or right beside it. Coca-Cola, 6 bottles in this handy container. I do remember when a lot of soda did come in bottles. I do remember that. But this Coca-Cola is going to take off. It was actually something that, and everybody knows this. This is true. It was created, I believe, by a pharmacist, and there was a reason why. But I know it was in the 1880s or something like that. But it did actually have cocaine in it for a while. So other than just the caffeine that's already there, wow. Okay, early Coca-Cola, I would not have been a fan with all my anxiety. Love this one too. Love it. You've got a couple things you can see in here. I mean, first of all, hang on, popping open a caffeine-free Diet Coke. I haven't had caffeine since February, as if anybody really cares, right? Huh? But I thought since I mentioned caffeine. Well, anyway, what you see here, check it out. The cool thing I really enjoy about the 20s advertising also is the fact that it's all hand drawn. I used to want to be a commercial artist, draw things like that. But by the time I grew up and was getting into, where I wanted to be with my art, everything was computerized. So anyway, these things are treasures. These things are hand drawn. But also look over there at the left and you see yeast foam. Yikes, okay. Man, yeast foam, that's enticing. But look at the little girl's hairdo. You can always tell a lot. You look at the hair, you look at the clothes, you look at the makeup, or you look at what kind of things are around them. But notice there's really not a brand name. It's just yeast foam. Makes delicious buckwheat cakes. Okay, now over on the right, we've got Dandy Shandy, made from sarsaparilla, nettles, and dandelion. Okay, the best of all non-alcoholic beverages. So that's an advertisement for, a drink that kind of, I don't know, reminds me of root beer, I guess. I suppose maybe that's a precursor to root beer. I don't know. But anyway, I like these ads, but the one on the left, you can see that there's no brand. I mean, yeast foam, but that makes me think of, say, a lot of things that started out as a brand name, like aspirin. Remember, aspirin used to be the brand name, and now there are many kinds of aspirin. So it's no longer a brand name. It's an actual different, whole different thing, a form of over-the-counter medicine. And there's so many things like that. So as the 20s roll along, advertising gets more and more sophisticated in some ways and targets their audience very well. My favorite of all, my favorite of all. Have I said that about all these advertising ones? Probably not, maybe. I don't know. But anyway, I love this one because, I mean, check it out. First of all, there we go with more cigarettes. But look at who they've got out there pitching the cigarettes. And look at the words they're using. I think it's hilarious. You've got 20,679 physicians. Okay, doctors. You got a stereotypical doctor up there of that, that time all the way up through probably the 60s. You had that as sort of a stereotypical physician look. You had the man, of course, dressed in white, um, lab coat or white in general, clean cut, maybe the little monocle type glasses, maybe just some other kind, stereotype, right? But anyway, this many physicians, these doctors say, okay, quote, listen to it and see if you see what's weird about this. Luckies are less irritating, end quote. Huh, less irritating. Does that mean I need to go try it? Because it's less irritating? I mean, there's a kid across the street that's less irritating than his little brother. Does that mean that I want to go and spend time hanging with that kid across the street who's less irritating because, well, he's irritating, but he's not as irritating as his little brother? I mean, come on. That is great advertising. But I don't know. I think it's awesome because what he's saying, or what they're saying actually, is you're going to smoke. You're going to smoke. So if you're going to smoke, you really should pick our cigarettes because they're less irritating. So again, they're not going to really understand. Well, tobacco companies, you can research into what they really understood much earlier than everybody else, but they're not going to really understand the depths of addiction and the depths of harm that smoking does to your body until much later. It's not until sometime in the 1960s that they start putting the warnings on cigarette packs and that they start really getting out the word of how dangerous cigarettes are. But basically, hey, you're gonna smoke. You might as well be less irritated. And then look there at the bottom. You've got it's toasted. Oh, yummy. Ugh. And then at the very bottom, your throat protection against irritation. Geez, that's a hard one to read. Your throat protection against irritation, against cough. Alrighty then. So I love that ad for all of the wrong reasons. Now, same thing with the next one. This is the last of the ads that I have. And I hear a collective sigh going out there because I'm enjoying it way too much. But look at this. Here's an ad. Wash away fat and years of age with Lamar reducing soap. Wow, that sounds too good to be true, but look at the picture. Look at what's happened. That's an amazing transformation. It's a new discovery, results quick and amazing, nothing internal to take. Reduce any part of the body desired without affecting any other parts. Wow, you mean I could, how is that going to work? Well, there's no dieting or exercise. Be as slim as you wish. Oh my goodness, how much does it cost? Well, it acts like magic, reducing the double chin. Abdomen, ungainly ankles. Oh, I've got to have that. Tell me, how much does it cost? Unbecoming wrist, arms, shoulders, large bust, or any superfluous fat on your body. Yeah, you sold me. I want it. How do I get it? Sold direct to you by mail. Postpaid on a money back guarantee. How in the world are they getting a money back guarantee on this? Hang on just a second. I'll tell you exactly how they're able to do that. All right. So the price is, what is that? 2 cents a cake, or 3 cakes for 4 cents, something like that. 1 to 3 cakes of soap usually accomplish the purpose. Okay. The purpose being that you were just taken by a false ad. Okay. That is illegal today. We have standards for advertising today. I remember watching it play out in the 1980s with the cola wars. Pepsi and Coke. They were having cola wars, and there was some advertising questions sometimes then, and also Papa John's a few years ago. Their slogan, "Better ingredients, better pizza." People were like, wait a minute. Wait, how can you say it's better ingredients? Isn't that false advertising? Well, you can look up what happened with that. But we do have some kind of standards of advertising, truth in advertising, that they didn't have back then. When I was a little kid, you still saw commercials in the 70s and probably in the 80s that would say, well, no, the 80s was when they started actually saying, like, Coke versus Pepsi, take a taste test, at the big, like I said, the cola wars. But when I was a little kid, I remember they would have ads that would say, our product versus the leading product, or our product versus brand X. That was a little bit older. That was probably from where I was watching, I don't know, maybe older stuff. I don't know. But this soap, that is crazy. And people, I'm sure, bought it. So, again, love the advertising. Sadly, we're done with it. So here on slide 21, we have the promised talkie. Okay, the first talkie, first motion picture with sound, as in talkie, is going to be the jazz singer. Well, look at this and you'll see it stars Al Jolson, and you also see Al Jolson in blackface. It's 1927. It's a shame that this is the first talking movie, because it also, as I said about advertising, it shows us a lot about our culture, and definitely the movies show a lot about the culture of the time. And blackface was a-okay at that moment in time, apparently, and it wasn't that long before that. It was really not that long before that they had vaudeville. And in vaudeville, you would have people going around the country and putting on shows in different places, and blackface was one of the things that they did. So I would ask you, if you get a chance, to look up, if you want to see, and I usually show this little clip in class, and I could link to it, but I don't know if I'll have time to do that. I'm trying like desperately had some technical issues going on over here, and I don't know if it's my internet. I don't know what it is, but it's been a little bit weird. But anyway, I would link to it, but you can easily go to YouTube and find a clip of Al Jolson singing in blackface the song Mammy, Mammy. Okay, Al Jolson. This was actually a movie that was used to show off his so-called great singing voice. I personally am not a fan, but yeah, tell me what you think if you watch it. With the rise of the movies in pop culture, even before the talking movies, we've got some pretty crazy stories that are going to be coming out. And one of the ones that's most famous is about a star named, well, his name was Roscoe, but he was called Fatty Arbuckle. And he was one of those, he's a big guy who was a comedian and ended up, having a very rough time here. And there you have up in the top left, you've got Arbuckle faces the gallows and all that. And you've got the mugshot. So, what is going on with this guy that he actually was blackballed from Hollywood? And he was one of the biggest stars of the silent era. I read a book when I was a teenager, I don't know, maybe 14 or 15, some very impressionable point in my life. And I already loved pop culture. And one of my friend's moms loaned me a book called Hollywood Babylon. It was all about the dark side of Hollywood. And scandals like this were all through that book, and I was fascinated by it. And I've watched several of Fatty Arbuckle's movies, at least pieces of them. I like silent movies. I like the comedies. I think that the comedies a lot of times are really funny and well done. But if you notice what he's accused of and what happens, you can see that why in the 1920s this is going to be such a big deal for Hollywood. And while there's a few different versions of the story, the basic story is that Fatty Arbuckle is going to be at a party and he ends up really um, raping a girl. And it's even worse because he's accused of raping a girl with a champagne bottle and she's going to die a few days later. So even though he's going to go through three trials, he's going to be found non guilty of manslaughter. He's not going to be allowed to come back and take up his career again. And this is a case of something that happens quite frequently that, well, Sacco and Vanzetti, where you have people being tried in the public eye. And, Fatty Arbuckle, again, I don't know what really happened. Apparently, nobody does because they didn't find enough evidence to convict him. But he was absolutely one of the biggest stars of the time. So that's one story you might not have heard about. But this guy, I'm sure you've heard of, Charlie Chaplin. I mean, maybe not, but I mean, this is iconic even for people that don't like silent movies. Charlie Chaplin's going to have a few scandals of his own. Charlie Chaplin is known for his role as the Little Tramp, and he's known for making a lot of very funny movies as well in the silent era, and he was iconic. Okay. So again, the little tramp character with the hat and the little mustache and all that, these are going to be really famous that everyone can identify, usually can identify as Charlie Chaplin. So what's going on with this dude in his personal life? Well, he's going to end up getting into quite a few issues over the years. And he doesn't die, really. He doesn't pass away until December of 1977. So he lived a very long life. He was, I know he was in acting on some form or another. He was acting for more than 70 years. So he had he had grown up in England, and he's going to be very talented. He writes, he produces, he directs, and he's going to have a reputation in Hollywood for womanizing. Okay, and if you see him without his you know, character, the little tramp, you see him without that outfit, he's actually, I think he's quite a very good looking man. So I mean, he was known um, for all of these type of things. He had some movies that were well known. Modern, was it Modern Times? I can't remember all the names of a lot of the movies, but and he wasn't. Fatty Arbuckle was actually more a guy that I really liked his movies more than Charlie Chaplin, to be perfectly honest. But you're going to have some of his famous movies. I don't know. I know there's one called The Kid. That was a famous one. And the um, the problems that he's going to end up with, again, as a womanizer, he's going to get married a second time, and he's marrying these young women. And so when he got married for the second time, the one that I remember most, she was a teenager, but he was in his 30s. So he knew this was wrong, because I remember they went out of the country to get married whenever that was in the 20s. And it turned out that he wasn't really happy. I mean, my goodness, she's 16, he's 35. I, I, I don't even know what they might have had in common besides acting, but it was unhappy. I know that because I remember reading that at some point she actually left him, and she accused him of all kinds of things, particularly abuse. And they're going to settle out of court. Okay, that was one of the cases that I remember reading about when I was a kid, thinking, wait, they settled out of court? And it was, I don't know, it was more than, I don't know how much it would be worth today, but I know it was more than $500,000 or something like that. It was very large settlement. And the thing is, he was very upset by all of that. He was upset by those allegations. Now, again, I don't know what really happened. Yeah, who knows what really happened. But he's going to go ahead and he's going to end up having some other scandals. When he was much older, he started dating a girl in her 20s. And as you may have noticed, that seems to be a pattern with him. So he's going to end up with a lot of controversial things coming up in his personal life. And some of that's going to be really, I guess, bleeding over into his work life. And there's a movie that comes out called The Great Dictator. I can't remember what year it came out, but I remember that it was during the time of Hitler, and it was a comedy, and it was seen by most people that they kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? They kind of trashed it before they ever saw it, because they were thinking, you can't make a comedy about Hitler, right? You can't do that. And so I know it was during the time Hitler was actively in charge of Germany, because that was why it was so very controversial. But it got a lot of bad reviews, and you're going to see a very interesting thing. And you can look up the movie called The Great Dictator on YouTube. It's probably there. I haven't seen it, haven't looked for it for a long time. But it had a bad, well, it had an ending that people didn't like. And that's one reason, if you can look up the Great Dictator and you can look at the ending, watch a little bit of it and look at the ending. But this is at the time where it's talking movies are already around by that point, by the time Hitler's around, as a you know as a very powerful leader. But he got into trouble with the ending. So what he does is he's going to actually talk to the people. In other words, he breaks that, what is it, the fourth wall, or whatever. He's going to actually speak directly to his audience. And so a lot of people really didn't care for that. They didn't want to know his politics. So you can judge for yourself if you want to check that out. It's interesting. Now again, he's going to continue to have a lot of other problems. The FBI starts to look into his personal life, and they're going to find that he had actually violated, they thought, something called the Mann Act, Mann Act. This was a law that came out that prevented white slavery, taking women across state boundaries for sexual purposes. We literally just talked about this in my women's history class, but I think I recorded that maybe yesterday, so we're kind of at the same spot. But anyway, he was accused of that, and if he was found guilty, he was going to end up in jail. So he was acquitted. There wasn't evidence that he had done anything like that, even though he's still going after very young girls and women. He was acquitted. Now, you're going to find that this acquittal is not going to start, it's not going to change the public's impression of him, let's put it that way. And even though he's going to stay married to this woman, I can't remember her name, he's going to stay married to her for a very long time, up until his death many years later. There was always that kind of of mark on, or an asterisk in people's minds beside his name. And he also had some paternity suits with some teenage girls when he was in his 50s, I think, I want to say, maybe 60s even. Paternity suits. I mean, my goodness. So anyway, Charlie Chaplin, there's a lot more to him than what you might know if you knew anything at all about him. There's a whole lot. There's a great book called Chaplin. It's just a really great book. And I think there was a movie, I want to say Robert Downey Jr. made a movie called Chaplin about him several years ago. But for somebody who's not really crazy about him, I sure did talk a long time about him. There had been a problem too with something ever since movies, even the silent movies. People were offended by a lot of things as they are today. Not necessarily the same things, and maybe not even to the same degree, I don't know. But there were, even in the silent movies, the movies were starting to get a little bit risque, maybe a little bit dirty. Okay. So people had started campaigns to get Hollywood to clean up their act. It just wasn't good for families anymore, they said. Now, truthfully, a lot of the things they were complaining about, you and me would look at and just probably laugh and say, really? That's what offended them back then? Well, it's serious enough that the owners of the studios do not want the government to come in and tell them how to make movies, right? So they create their own internal association called the Motion Picture Association. It will eventually become the MPAA, the Motion Picture Association of America. Now, Will Hayes, who used to be Postmaster General, is going to be put in charge of this, and he can ban anything that might offend anybody. And so he uses that power quite broadly. Believe me, he bans darn near anything. Here's another slide with a lot of writing on it. I'm not going to read this to you. You can read this on your own. I'm just going to pull out a couple things. So Will Hays is going to have this code. It's called the Hays Code, the production code. It simply became known as the code. And the rules were starting in 1930. Now imagine, again, if you've watched movies from the 30s or even silent movies, pretty much, unless you were specifically looking for them, you're not going to find much that's offensive in there, if anything. But okay, the times were different. So he's going to put this, enacted in 1930, but you're not going to have to pay any penalties for breaking them until 1934 addendum says, we can't release these films anymore unless we get to look at them first. Okay, that's when things really get tough for trying to express real life in movies. Not that a lot of the movies were expressing a lot of real life, but the things that they banned, or the things that Will Hays banned under the code: homosexuality, nudity, suggestive dances. I have that in quotes because I don't know what that is. You don't know what that is. It's one of those things that I would say would be very subjective. Childbirth. Oh, childbirth. That's natural. You can't even refer in the 1950s, I believe it was 1952, on TV. You couldn't rely on the television to be any freer during that era. So when Lucille Ball was pregnant in real life, there I am with Lucy again, but on I Love Lucy, they're not allowed to say pregnant. They dance all around that. She was pregnant in real life, she was pregnant on the show, and not a word was said on that show about pregnancy. They hinted at it in many ways, and same thing in movies. Okay, they tried to avoid it if they had any way to avoid it. Okay, all clergymen have to be presented in a serious and respectful manner. Okay, vulgarity, vengeance, miscegenation, naughty language, and excessive and lustful kissing are all against the rules. Okay, so again, excessive and lustful kissing. I don't know what that is on a screen, but I guess we would know it if we saw it. It's subjective though. So anyway, what we see is a very vanilla, very clean set of movies from that point on up until the late 1960s, really. So you can read, through that again, but the audience should never see criminals, adultery, or premarital sex in a positive light. The United States government and its employees must be shown as a force for good. Okay, so you're going to see in movies, the one that I can think of, and it happens to have Lucille Ball in it, but also had Bob Hope, and I cannot ever remember the name of that movie, but it was during this time, and the characters that they played were planning to go and have an affair. Okay, he was married to some other woman, she was married to some other man, but they were working out the details throughout this movie. But by the end of that movie, again, Lucille Ball and Bob Hope, I can't remember the name of it, but by the time they got to the end of that movie, both of them had seen the light, and they had decided that adultery was not for them, and they were going to go back to their, spouses. And that's because of things like the code. Okay, the code is still going to be enforced. And so the movies that you're watching for that almost 30-year period are going to be ones that are safe for all of the family to watch. There's going to be nothing offensive to, as I said, most any of us. You know what? I'm going to look up that movie too, because I want to know what movie that is, just in case. And any of these things I mentioned, to be honest with you, any of these things that I mentioned, if you want to watch any of them, if you can find any of them, I will be more than happy to give you extra credit. There it is, The Facts of Life. It came out in 1960. Okay, so By the end of it, again, you're going to find that they decide, hey, this is wrong. We shouldn't do this. And now you know why. We don't get the rating system until we need it, though. That's going to be the late 1960s, and you're going to have all these ratings, G and PG, and then eventually PG-13 and R, and then eventually NC-17, and of course X, and all kinds of stuff. But one thing that happened in the late 60s was people started really pushing that envelope, and you saw some more independent movie, you know, instead of going through the big studio names, you saw some more independent movies, and you just saw people that really were tired of portraying life in such a bland way. So there's some movies. There was Marathon Man. That was maybe the 70s, but there was one. It starred John Voight and Dustin Hoffman. It was called Midnight Cowboy. That one was actually rated X. Okay, and it wasn't for pornography. It's considered now to be a classic. Midnight Cowboy. John Voight's character, if I'm not mistaken, was a male prostitute at that time, something like that. So anyway, it was a movie that was trying to show the darker side of life. And there was a movie called The Graduate, which is still to this day one of my favorite movies. It came out in, I think it was 1967 or 68, and you're going to have a young man played again by Dustin Hoffman. Wait a minute. Dustin Hoffman plays a young man named Benjamin who just graduated from college, and he falls kind of for this girl. But before he met this girl, really, or before he had seen her, because I think they knew each other when they were kids, he ends up having an affair with her mother, and that gets to be really complicated. So the code is going to have to finally give way to these type of movies that are portraying a lot more risque subjects, and trying to protect who should be allowed to watch these movies with the rating system. We're on slide 27, and that's radio. So you had radios before that, radios, right? But you didn't have commercial radio. So you had ham radios, you could talk to people, and that type of thing, communication. But commercial radio is going to start in 1920. And the very first commercial radio station is going to be coming from Pittsburgh, KDKA. Now today, you have the call letters for the stations for radio and television, local radio and television stations. If you go, is it, I guess, west of the Mississippi, you have K, like KTLA, and some of those that I grew up watching. They were they were K whatever. And then I believe east of the Mississippi, if I'm not wrong, you're going to have W, like WAVE, WHAS, those things. That's TV and radio, the call letters. But so I don't know. I don't know when that changed, because KDKA is obviously further east. So what we see then is NBC is the first national radio network, National Broadcasting Company, if you've ever wondered what NBC stands for, or if you even watch any network television at all today. So it's going to be less centralized than film. You're not going to have Will Hayes up there telling people how to portray life in their movies, and they're going to be individualized all over the country. So you're going to have really nobody paying a lot of attention to what radio is doing. So some of the early radio programming was actually a lot worse than what they were trying to clean up in Hollywood in movies, because there was no regulation at all. This is just a fun little slide with a few interesting items. 1920s is the decade of entertainment, and you've got Rin Tin Tin. He used to be a he was the famous movie dog, most famous dog to ever star in the movies in 1923. But he actually was a starving German Shepherd that someone found and saved, rescued during World War One. And I don't know, Rin Tin Tin. I mean, that's well before my time. Even though they were still making movies about Rin Tin Tin, or maybe a TV show, maybe up until the 50s or something. But that's still way before all of our time. But it's worth noting that, famous dog star. I love that idea too. Now, first Miss America contest, which I personally think has kind of run its, I think it's kind of run as far as it needs to go, the Miss America contest, but that's just my opinion. But it was held in September of 1921. And then Mickey Mouse becomes famous in Steamboat Willie, and he looks a little bit different in his first, first live, not live action, but first motion cartoons, black and white, I believe. But yeah, that's where we get Mickey Mouse. There's a lot of other things going on in the 20s. If we were in class, I would be saying the same thing to you. So you might want to remember some of these, because the 1920s is all about fun, even though we know that everyone's not having fun because of the poverty level and all that. But it's still a time when entertainment is going to be king. So we have, for example, the crossword puzzle. Okay, crossword puzzles, if I'm not mistaken, came out around 1912 in newspapers and became a real fad during the 1920s. Also, you're going to have college boys doing some really wild stunts. Like, for example, there were contests where they would try to see who could swallow the most live goldfish. Yes, I said that right. I don't know. They were trying to see who could swallow the most live goldfish. I don't know. That's a college thing. Also, how many guys they could fit in a telephone booth, if you've ever seen a telephone booth. If you haven't and you've seen Doctor Who, it's kind of the same thing. But they were doing all sorts of wild things. The one that I love to tell students about in person, though, just to see the look on their faces, is there was a thing called flagpole sitting. Okay, they had flagpole sitting contest. Yep, we're going to climb to the top of that flagpole and I'm going to see how long I can sit up here. Now, I don't mean they're going to sit up there for, I don't know, an hour, 20 minutes, or they would sit up there for days on these flagpoles. Now, also, you have to know they're going to have a little place to sit up there, although that would terrify me. But you're going to have a little place to sit, and I believe they allowed for breaks if you needed to go to the bathroom, I think, which kind of, you know, I don't know. Does that sound right to you guys? I mean, should they make them stay up there the whole time? I don't know. I do know that it was started. I think it was on a dare. One guy dared another guy to go sit up there. How long could he stay up there? But you did have, a little place, like I said, to sit up there. But the record, I think, is going to be a guy who sat up there on the flagpole. I'm assuming it had to be with bathroom breaks, because I know it was somewhere around 50 days. And if I'm not mistaken about that, I think bad weather finally forced that guy to come down. And I don't remember what year that was, but I know it was at its height during the, I want to say somewhere during the, probably late 20s was when flagpole sitting was at its height. So I think that's just kind of an interesting little thing that sort of goes away during the Depression, when people are seeking out other kinds of entertainment rather than, doing something that's kind of physically risky. Really important thing that came out of the 1920s is called the Harlem Renaissance. Harlem Renaissance is going to be a, sorry, excuse me, it's going to be a movement in a place, a area, a region of New York City that is going to be led by African Americans. And the Harlem Renaissance is going to be this social and artistic and um, intellectually important time because you're going to see so many beautiful things like poetry and writing, beautiful essays, paintings and sculpture. You're going to have jazz and swing music coming out of the Harlem Renaissance. So it's so very important. And it's going to be African Americans expressing themselves, and it spreads out eventually to white people. And they start to actually really start to to enjoy the black culture. So it's going to take a while before the Harlem culture, the music and all the other beautiful stuff that comes out of it, it's going to take a while before it really does hit white America. It's going to take a while, and you're going to see that um, World War One and all of the changes that were going on and all of the urbanization and everything. This is all going to lead to something that if you studied African American history, you may have heard of the Great Migration. Great Migration is where we have tons of Black Americans moving up north. And so we end up with a lot of people settling in places like Harlem, where they have their own culture, and it's going to be, in this case, a really great culture that comes out of it because we're going to have, and I have some pictures up here. I have where you can see a couple of things, but you're going to have one of my favorite essayists of all time, Zora Neale Hurston. She was a not only a great writer, but she's going to be someone who is also going to work in filmmaking, and she is absolutely amazing to read. If you've never read any of her essays and you're a reader, highly recommend that. We also have Claude McKay. He's a Jamaican writer, and he's really important. He's going to write about, I think it's 5 books that are just beautiful as well. And then we have the poet Langston Hughes. Langston Hughes is a poet, but he's also many other things. Okay, he's going to write plays, he's going to write stories and essays and novels, and he's going to be a guy that also helps spread the word about this new type of music called jazz. Okay. So Langston Hughes is absolutely seminal in this. So, as far as the music goes, you're going to have a lot of people you may or may not have heard of. You have Duke Ellington, who I certainly hope you've heard of. Okay, Duke Ellington was the leader of a great jazz orchestra, and he could write, he could play, he was amazing. And he's going to be around, Duke Ellington's going to be around in the music industry for at least 50 years, probably longer than that. Louis Armstrong, he was the one that played the trumpet, and he's going to be around also a long time, very influential. He's amazing. If you've never, I like all kinds of music. There's very little music that I could just say, "Ooh, I don't like that." I like all kinds of music. I have jazz. I have all I have every kind of music you could possibly think of, probably somewhere in my house on on some kind of way to store it, either vinyl or CDs, or even go back way back to cassettes and all kinds of stuff. And if you've not heard some of these, if you haven't read some of these are really, this is an absolutely amazing time that happens in the African American community, where you have these people all coming together and being very very much competitors with each other for the just like today, the singers and the musicians are competing for sales or for people to listen to their music or whatever. But also they supported each other quite a lot. The the artists, the writers, the musicians, and all kinds of things. So there's a whole lot of stuff you could study about the Harlem Renaissance, and we don't have time. And we could talk about Dizzy Gillespie. We could talk about so many others. But if you have a chance, especially while you're off school, if you're not working a lot, if you have a chance to read or listen to any of that, I would be totally happy to give you, if you haven't already used up all your extra credit points, I'd be happy to give you some extra credit if you'll just go and maybe listen to some of the jazz from that time, or read a little bit of some of the writers of that time, and just tell me what you thought of it. Okay, because that's something that everyone should be exposed to. So you also have up there in the top, on the pictures I have over there, you have the Apollo Theater. The Apollo is going to be one of the great theaters where people are going to come. Eventually, white folks are going to come over and listen to the music at places like the Apollo. And I can't believe I didn't see Billie Holiday over there. As far as the musicians, Billie Holiday, one of the great female vocalists from that era. So again, this is where we're going to end for the 1920s slideshow one. So anyway, I'll try to have the second one up as soon as possible. I reiterate, we've been having some technical issues here. I don't know if it is my internet. I don't know if it's trying to upload too many things at one time, which has happened at least once, I guess. But there are some technical issues, so I'm working as fast as I can get these things out. So anyway, bye for now.